The crystalline spires of the Imperial Palace on Araxis Prime pierced the amber sky like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the light of 3 setting suns. Inside the Grand Combat Chamber, Princess Selene stood before the Imperial Court, her silver scales dulled with exhaustion and shame. The training simulation's holographic interface flickered and died, along with her latest attempt to prove herself worthy of her bloodline. Enough. Emperor Thorn's voice cut through the whispers of the assembled nobles like a plasma blade. His massive frame, covered in battle-scarred iridescent scales, seemed to absorb the chamber's light. "My daughter, you disappoint me yet again." Selene's secondary hearts constricted painfully. She forced herself to meet her father's 4 eyes, each one a different shade of gold, all reflecting the same disappointment. "Father, if you would just allow me to explain my theoretical approach to combat." Theories. The Emperor's laugh was sharp enough to make the younger nobles flinch. "Theories do not win wars, daughter. Theories do not maintain an empire that spans 17 star systems." From her position near the Emperor's throne, High General Vex clicked her mandibles in barely concealed amusement. "Your Majesty, perhaps it is time to consider alternative succession arrangements. Your nephew, Prince Carix, shows remarkable promise in the combat arts." Selene's scaled hands clenched into fists. Carix was everything she wasn't. Aggressive, traditionally minded, and above all, strong in the ways the Araxian Empire valued strength. While she spent her time studying combat theory and xenobiology, he led war games and crushed training drones with his bare hands. "No." Emperor Thorn's secondary breathing membrane fluttered, a sign of deep thought that Selene had catalogued in her endless studies of Araxian biology. "The bloodline must remain pure." He turned to Admiral Zara, whose cybernetic enhancements hummed softly in the tense silence. "What of these humans we've been hearing about?" "An interesting species, Your Majesty." Admiral Zara's artificial eye whirred as she accessed her databanks. "Physically weaker than Araxians, shorter-lived, but—" She paused, her organic eye gleaming. "Their combat capabilities are remarkable. Despite their limitations, they've managed to hold their own in several recent conflicts. Their adaptability and tactical innovation are particularly noteworthy." "Humans." High General Vex spat the word like a curse. "You would bring a primitive species into the Imperial Palace." But Selene saw something in her father's expression, a calculating look she'd learned to recognize from years of studying his every micro-expression, hoping to win his approval through understanding rather than strength. "Admiral." Emperor Thorn's voice held a new note, something almost like amusement. "Contact our allies in the Earth Defense Force. I want their best combat instructor. Someone who can turn." He waved a hand dismissively at Selene. "This into a warrior worthy of the throne." 2 standard cycles later, Selene stood in the palace's atmospheric adjustment chamber, watching their new arrival undergo decontamination. Commander Sarah Chen floated in the purification field, her dark hair drifting in the zero-gravity environment. Despite being subjected to the humiliating entrance protocols required for all non-Araxians, the human's posture remained relaxed, almost amused. "Fascinating," scientific advisor Kex muttered, analyzing readings from her instruments. "Their skeletal structure is entirely internal. How do they maintain structural integrity during combat?" "Observe its size," another advisor whispered, "barely larger than a juvenile Araxian. The Emperor cannot be serious about." The decontamination cycle completed with a musical chime. Commander Chen dropped to the deck with a grace that made several palace guards shift uneasily. Her dark eyes scanned the room, taking in details with a speed that Selene's research suggested shouldn't be possible for human neural processing. Commander Sarah Chen, Earth Defense Force Special Operations, retired, she announced in flawless Imperial standard, courtesy of her neural translator. "I hear you're looking for a combat instructor." Her gaze fell on Selene, and the princess was startled to see not the usual dismissal or pity, but something like recognition. You must be Princess Celine. I've reviewed your combat theory papers. Your analysis of multi-gravitational battlefield dynamics is brilliant. The assembled advisors murmured in shock. Celine felt her scales flush with an iridescent sheen, a biological response she'd never quite learned to control. You've read my work. Required reading at the Earth Defense Force Advanced Tactical School now, Sarah said with a small smile. Your theoretical models helped us redesign our zeroed combat protocols. She turned to address the watching nobles directly. Your princess isn't weak. She just sees warfare differently than you do. And in my experience, different isn't always wrong. For the first time in her life, Celine felt something new stir beneath her scales. Not hope exactly, but possibility. As Commander Chen was led away to her quarters, the princess caught fragments of conversation from the departing nobles. Madness, High General Vex muttered. The Emperor diminishes us all by bringing this creature here. But Celine wasn't listening. She was too busy calculating the tensile strength required for an internal skeleton to support combat maneuvers, and wondering if perhaps there was more than one way to be strong. The private training chamber's quantum field generators hummed as Commander Sarah Chen circled Princess Celine, her dark eyes narrowed in concentration. Your problem isn't your combat skills, she said finally. It's that everyone's trying to make you fight like a traditional Araxian warrior. Isn't that what I should be? Celine asked, her scaled fingers tracing equations in the air, a nervous habit she'd never managed to break. Our combat traditions are based on thousands of years of proven battlefield success. And how many of those battles were fought against enemies who think differently than you do? Sarah moved to the chamber's control panel, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Show me your standard combat stance. Celine assumed the position she'd been taught since childhood, legs braced wide, arms positioned to maximize striking power, secondary breathing membranes fully extended. Every movement precisely as prescribed by the Imperial Combat Codex. Now, Sarah said, tell me why you're standing like that. To maximize power generation through the kinetic chain while maintaining optimal defensive positioning for. Celine began reciting. No. Sarah's interruption was sharp. Don't tell me what the manual says. Tell me why you are standing like that. Celine's scales rippled with confusion. I don't understand. Exactly. Sarah initiated a training sequence, and a holographic opponent materialized. Watch me. The human moved like nothing Celine had ever seen. Where Araxian combat was all about overwhelming force and unbreakable defense, Sarah flowed around her opponent's attacks like water through crystal lattices. She used momentum and angles in ways that seemed to defy the very physics Celine had spent years studying. Your research on multi-gravitational combat showed that traditional Araxian stances become 47% less effective when gravity exceeds 1.5 standard units, Sarah said, disabling the hologram. But you never applied that knowledge to your own fighting style. Why? Because Celine's secondary hearts raced as new possibilities began unfolding in her mind. Because I was trying to be what everyone expected, not what would actually work. Exactly. Sarah's smile held approval. Now, let's see what happens when we combine your theoretical knowledge with some practical application. Over the next several days, they developed something entirely new. Sarah introduced Celine to earth martial arts, Aikido, Capoeira, Wing Chun, not to copy them, but to understand their principles. Meanwhile, Celine's deep knowledge of xenobiology and physics helped them adapt these techniques to Araxian physiology. Your secondary breathing membranes, Sarah noted during one session, they can detect air pressure changes, right? Yes, it helps us anticipate atmospheric shifts in space combat. So you can literally feel an attack coming before it hits you. That's not a weakness to be hidden. It's an advantage no human could ever have. But not everyone appreciated their innovations. High General Vex and her supporters became increasingly vocal in their opposition. This is an abomination. she declared after witnessing one of their training sessions. "You're corrupting our sacred combat traditions with alien barbarism." Interesting choice of words, Sarah remarked after the general had stormed out. "Considering that your sacred traditions seem remarkably similar to techniques I've seen in Earth's historical records. Evolution tends to find similar solutions across different species." The breakthrough came during their third week of training. Celine was sparring with a combat drone programmed with traditional Araxian patterns. Instead of trying to match its power, she moved the way Sarah had taught her, using her smaller size and enhanced sensory abilities to her advantage. The drone's attacks became increasingly erratic as its combat algorithms failed to predict her movements. "Do you see?" Sarah asked as Celine disabled the drone with a precise strike to its control center. "Your people's strength isn't wrong, but it's not the only right way either. The most powerful warriors aren't the ones who blindly follow tradition. They're the ones who understand why those traditions worked and when they need to evolve." But their success had consequences. That evening, as Celine was reviewing combat footage in her quarters, her environmental controls suddenly malfunctioned. The atmosphere began shifting to a mix lethal to Araxian biology. Sarah, arriving for their evening strategy session, recognized the familiar smell of sabotage. She'd spent enough time in war zones to know an assassination attempt when she saw one. Moving with practiced efficiency, she overrode the controls and helped Celine evacuate. "Your enemies are getting desperate," she observed as palace security swept the room. "They're afraid of me." Celine's scales had paled to a sickly gray from the toxic exposure. "I'm just learning to fight differently." "No." Sarah's expression was grim. "They're afraid because you're proving that different can be better. And that means everything they believe about power and tradition might be wrong." As they relocated to secure quarters, Celine realized that her true battle wouldn't be won in the training chamber. She wasn't just learning to fight. She was challenging the very foundations of Araxian society. And some people would rather see her dead than allow that change to take root. "Tomorrow," Sarah announced as they settled into their new location, "we start learning about something humans call asymmetric warfare. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with fists at all." The royal archives of Araxis Prime held millennia of combat knowledge, stored in crystalline matrices that pulsed with soft blue light. Sarah Chen sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic displays showing ancient battle formations. Beside her, Princess Celine was deep in analysis, her scaled fingers dancing through the data streams. "There," Celine pointed to a particular sequence. "The Throne Wars of the Third Dynasty. When Empress Vexera introduced plasma weapons, the traditional shield formations became obsolete overnight. The conservatives tried to ban the new technology, claiming it dishonored our combat traditions." "And?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "She executed the conservative faction's leaders in single combat, using those same plasma weapons. The reforms went through the next day." Celine's scales shifted to a thoughtful purple hue. "Perhaps some traditions exist only because nobody dared to question them." Their scholarly discussion was interrupted by a slight disturbance in the air, barely noticeable to human senses, but Celine's breathing membranes flared in warning. Sarah moved without hesitation, tackling the princess as a needle-thin projectile whispered through the space where she'd been sitting. "Sonic dampeners," Sarah noted, rolling them both behind a data terminal. "High-end tech. Your would-be assassin has expensive friends." Palace security found no trace of the attacker, but Sarah had expected that. What interested her more was Celine's reaction. Not fear, but analytical curiosity. Even as they swept the archives for additional threats, the princess was theorizing about the assassination attempt's mechanics. "The projectile's trajectory suggests they accounted for air resistance and gravity variables, but not for my enhanced sensing capabilities," Celine mused. "They're still underestimating me, treating me like a standard target." Sarah smiled. This was why she'd agreed to take this assignment when Earth Defense Force forwarded the Emperor's request. She'd read Celine's combat theories and seen not weakness, but a mind that could revolutionize warfare itself, if given the chance to bloom. Their training evolved. Sarah taught Celine Earth military history alongside physical combat. They studied guerrilla warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the art of turning an enemy's strength against them. Celine absorbed it all, her brilliant mind finding connections between human innovation and Araxian capabilities that even Sarah hadn't considered. Your scales, Sarah observed during one session, they can shift color based on your emotional state, right? But you can also control them consciously. Yes, though we're taught to maintain a neutral silver as proper for nobility. What if we use that? Create patterns that disrupt targeting systems, confuse organic opponents' depth perception. Sarah grinned. Turn a primitive biological trait into a tactical advantage. The attempts on Celine's life continued, growing bolder. Training drones reprogrammed to lethal settings, poisoned atmospheric filters. Each time, the combination of Sarah's combat experience and Celine's analytical mind kept them one step ahead. But the true danger revealed itself during a diplomatic reception. Prince Kirix approached them, his scales shimmering with false warmth. "Cousin," he addressed Celine while pointedly ignoring Sarah, "the High Council is concerned about your unconventional training methods. Perhaps it's time to remember who you are, what you are." "And what am I, cousin?" Celine's voice was calm, but Sarah noticed her scales rippling with subtle patterns, not random emotional response, but deliberate signals they'd developed for secure communication. "You are an Araxian princess." Kyrix's secondary breathing membranes flared with barely contained aggression. "Not some human science experiment. The old houses are watching, cousin. The purebloods remember their duty to the Empire's traditions." After he left, Sarah and Celine exchanged glances. "The assassination attempts," Celine said quietly. "They're not just about removing me from succession. They're about preventing change itself." "Your cousin's not working alone," Sarah agreed. "That was a message and a warning. The conservative houses are uniting against you." That night, they found evidence of an encrypted quantum transmission from the palace to an unknown destination. The encryption was sophisticated, but Celine's theoretical knowledge of quantum mechanics, combined with Sarah's practical experience in military communications, allowed them to decrypt fragments. Elimination has failed, stronger than anticipated. Human influence spreading. Must act before the Grand Tournament. The Grand Tournament, the ultimate test of combat prowess in the Empire, where future rulers proved their worth before the assembled houses. It was scheduled to begin in just 2 weeks. "They're planning something big," Sarah mused. "The tournament would be perfect cover. Death in combat is always a risk, after all." Celine's scales shifted to deep blue, her thinking color. "Then we'll be ready. You've taught me that combat isn't just about strength or skill. It's about changing the rules of engagement itself." Sarah watched her student, no, her friend, with pride. The timid princess who'd once apologized for her own existence was gone. In her place stood a warrior who combined the best of two species' approaches to combat and leadership. "We're going to need help," Sarah said. "People inside the palace structure who aren't bound by traditional thinking." "The maintenance crews," Celine replied immediately. "The drone programmers. The atmosphere technicians. All the lesser workers the nobles never notice, but who see everything." Sarah grinned. "Now you're thinking like a human insurgent." "No," Celine's scales rippled with determination. "I'm thinking like myself, and that's what they fear most." The Grand Tournament arena stretched toward Araxis Prime's amber sky like a massive crystal flower. Inside, representatives from every noble house in the Empire gathered to witness the ancient trials that would determine their future leadership. But in the preparation chambers below, Princess Celine and Sarah Chen were focused on more immediate concerns. "They've changed the combat drone protocols," Celine reported, her scales shifting through diagnostic patterns as she accessed the tournament data feeds. Every competitor must face standardized opponents programmed with traditional Araxian combat forms. Of course they have. Sarah checked the reinforced training wraps on Celine's hands, a human tradition they'd modified for Araxian physiology. They're trying to force you into traditional combat patterns, make you fight their way. Then they've already made their first mistake. Celine's scales rippled with anticipation. They still think this is about fighting styles. The tournament's opening ceremony was a spectacle of light and sound, crystalline holograms recreating great battles from Imperial history. Emperor Thorn presided from his elevated throne, his expression unreadable as High General Vex announced the competitors. "Remember," Sarah murmured as Celine prepared to enter, "they'll be watching for our training. Expecting human techniques. Show them something they've never seen." The first round pitted Celine against a warrior from House Krull, a mountain of cybernetically enhanced muscle and aggression. He charged with traditional Araxian power, expecting to overwhelm the smaller princess. Instead, his attacks met empty air as Celine moved with liquid grace, her scales shifting in mesmerizing patterns that disrupted his targeting systems. "What trickery is this?" he bellowed as another strike missed. "Fight properly, princess." "I am," Celine replied, then demonstrated exactly how her theoretical understanding of physics could be applied to combat. The warrior's own momentum became his undoing, his enhanced strength useless against opponents who simply weren't where he struck. The crowd's reaction was mixed, some cheering the innovative display, others muttering about dishonor and tradition. But none could deny the effectiveness as warrior after warrior fell to Celine's unprecedented combination of human fluidity and Araxian sensory capabilities. "The princess mocks our traditions," High General Vex proclaimed after Celine's third victory. "These human corruptions insult the very foundations of our combat heritage." Interesting perspective. Emperor Thorn's voice cut through the protests. "Continue." The quarterfinals brought a new challenge. Prince Kirix himself, his scales gleaming with barely contained rage. "Cousin," he sneered, "let's see how your theories fare against real Imperial combat mastery." But Kirix had trained all his life to fight traditional opponents. Against Celine's hybrid style, his perfect form became a liability. She used his expectations against him, turning his own power and aggression into weapons. "Impossible," he roared as she slipped past his guard again. "You were weak." "Nothing." "No," Celine's scales pulsed with cool confidence. "I was different. You just couldn't see the strength in difference." The finishing sequence was beautiful in its simplicity, a combination of Araxian power and human technique that left the prince unconscious before he realized what had happened. The arena erupted in chaos. "Disqualification," High General Vex demanded. "These corrupted techniques violate tournament regulations." "Do they?" Sarah's voice carried across the arena as she approached the judges' panel. "Please, show us where in the Imperial Combat Codex it forbids innovation. Or is the Empire so weak that it cannot survive new ideas?" The silence was deafening. Emperor Thorn rose slowly, all four eyes fixed on his daughter. "The princess advances," he declared, "and I find myself curious to see what other surprises she has prepared." But victory had its price. That evening, as they reviewed footage of the matches, Celine's advanced senses detected an anomaly in the tournament's power grid. The quantum containment fields, she realized. They're creating harmonic instabilities in the barrier systems. Sarah's expression hardened. The assassination attempts failed, so they're planning something bigger. If those fields fail during the finals, the backlash would kill everyone in the arena. Celine's scales shifted to tactical red, including my father. The perfect coup. The old guard could blame it on my dangerous new techniques. They worked through the night, Celine's theoretical knowledge combining with Sarah's practical experience in sabotage detection. They discovered an elaborate web of carefully hidden programs, all designed to cascade into catastrophic failure during the final matches. "We can't stop it without revealing we know," Sarah noted. "And if we expose it too soon, They'll just try something else. Celine's scales rippled with determination. So we don't stop it. We use it. Now you're thinking like a tactician. Sarah grinned. What's the plan? First, we contact our allies in maintenance. Then, Celine's scales shifted to deep purple, her strategic planning color. Then we show them why undermining my weaknesses was their biggest mistake. The final day of the grand tournament dawned with all three suns of Araxes Prime aligned in a rare conjunction, bathing the arena in golden light. In the preparation chamber, Sarah watched Celine make final adjustments to her combat sensors. Remember, Sarah said quietly, they're expecting us to try to stop their plan. The best deception is to let your enemy think they're succeeding. Celine finished. Her scales rippled with subtle patterns, communicating with their hidden allies throughout the arena. The maintenance crews report all modified systems are ready. Drone programming has been adjusted. Now we wait. The arena was packed beyond capacity. Nobles from every house in the empire present to witness what they believed would be the end of an era. High General Vex stood proudly with her conspirators, their confidence evident in their posture. The final matches were structured as a gauntlet. Multiple opponents faced in succession, testing endurance as well as skill. Celine's first opponent was a cybernetically enhanced warrior from House Drell, his movements precise and powerful. But something was different about Celine's fighting style now. She moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible even compared to her earlier matches, her scales shifting in patterns that made her form appear to blur and distort. Quantum field manipulation, one noble muttered. She's using the arena's own containment systems to enhance her movements. Indeed, Celine had turned her understanding of the sabotaged systems into an advantage. Where others saw only weaponized failure waiting to happen, she saw possibilities. Each instability in the quantum fields became an opportunity, each power fluctuation a chance to move in ways that defied traditional physics. As opponent after opponent fell, High General Vex's confidence began to waver. The catastrophic failure they'd planned wasn't just failing to stop Celine. She was somehow turning it to her advantage. The final match brought her face to face with the Empire's most decorated warrior, Grand Champion Xarketh. 7 feet of bioengineered perfection, enhanced with the finest cybernetics credits could buy. Your human tricks end here, princess, he growled, activating combat protocols that hummed through his enhanced frame. Celine's response was to shift her scales into a pattern Sarah recognized, not combat camouflage, but an equation. The mathematical formula describing quantum field harmonics. The battle that followed was unlike anything the Empire had ever witnessed. Xarketh's raw power and traditional mastery clashed with Celine's unprecedented fusion of theoretical knowledge and practical application. She didn't just fight him. She turned the very physics of the arena into her ally. Now, High General Vex commanded, activating the final sequence of their sabotage. The quantum containment fields began to destabilize, energy cascading through the arena's crystal structure. But instead of the catastrophic collapse they planned, something else happened. The energy followed new pathways. Pathways Celine and her maintenance crew allies had carefully prepared. The power that was meant to destroy instead flowed through the arena like a living thing. Impossible, Vex screamed. The calculations were perfect. They were, Celine agreed, her voice carrying clearly as she continued to dance through Xarketh's increasingly desperate attacks. But you calculated assuming traditional responses. You've never considered that someone might understand the physics well enough to reshape the field entirely. The revelation of the assassination plot threw the arena into chaos. Noble houses that had backed Vex's conspiracy suddenly found their communication channels flooded with evidence of their involvement, transmitted through their own encrypted networks. In the midst of the chaos, Xarketh overloaded his cybernetics in one final desperate attack. But Celine had anticipated this too. She moved like water through the quantum fields, redirecting his enhanced strength back into his own systems. The champion fell, his perfectly engineered body short-circuited by his own power. Enough. Emperor Thorn's voice cut through the chaos. He stood, all four eyes blazing. High General Vex, you and your conspirators are guilty of treason against the Empire. My Emperor, Vex pleaded, everything I did was to preserve our traditions, our way of life. No. Celine's voice was calm as she faced her former tormentor. You did it because you feared change. Because the idea that strength might come in different forms threatened your understanding of power itself. The arrest of the conspirators was almost anticlimactic after the drama of the combat. As Imperial security led them away, Emperor Thorn descended to the arena floor. My daughter, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the arena, you have proven yourself not just a warrior, but a leader. One who understands that true strength lies not in blind adherence to tradition, but in the wisdom to know when tradition must evolve. Later, in the privacy of the royal quarters, Sarah found Celine studying the ancient combat texts with new eyes. You're leaving soon, Celine said. It wasn't a question. My job here is done. Sarah smiled. You've created something entirely new, not human, not traditional Araxian, but a path forward that's uniquely yours. The nobles are already calling it quantum combat theory. Celine's scales rippled with amusement. Though I think practical physics application in enhanced gravitational environments is more accurate. Keep that sense of humor, Sarah advised. You're going to need it. Change never comes easily, especially to empires. But it does come, Celine said firmly. And thanks to you, I'm ready to lead that change. As Sarah prepared to depart for Earth, she watched Celine begin teaching her new techniques to a group of young warriors, their scales shifting with excitement as they learned to see combat, and themselves, in a new way. The human smiled. Sometimes the greatest victories weren't won through strength alone, but through the courage to imagine different ways of being strong.